Okay, everyone, welcome to today's nature seminar. And that's great to come here, especially on such a gorgeous afternoon. Appreciate you coming in to do a dark lecture theatre. And before I introduce our speaker today, just to mention some of the seminars we've got coming up in the next few weeks, all at the same time. I think all of them in the same lecture theatre, but all in the same building. Next week, we've got Gareth Williams on climate change and coral reefs. And the week after, we have Rob Salguero Gomez from Oxford on quantifying and predicting ecosystem resilience from individuals to populations. And then Rachel Carmenta the week after on connected conservation, rethinking conservation for a telecoupled world. And then we've got Tom Harwood on a future for nature, a quantitative perspective on land and biodiversity under global change. And one that I haven't got here online yet, but July the 11th, we have a debate at the Natural History Museum between George Monbiot and Alan Savory on holistic grazing and whether livestock management can contribute to climate change mitigation. So that should be interesting. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Mike Morecroft is somebody who I've known and collaborated with since it came coming to Oxford almost 15, 20 years ago, particularly in the context of Whiten. Now he's principal specialist for climate change at Natural England, and also he's played a major role in the working group 2 of the IPCC, where he was coordinating lead author, particularly on the chapter on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. His PhD was from Cambridge on mountain plants in Scotland, and his postdoc was in Manchester on pollution in upland systems. And then he was at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and in Wallingford, looking at long-term monitoring, climate change, adaptation, and carbon cycling. And then in 2009, he moved to his position in Natural England, which we'll hear more about today. And after Mike's talk, we will have a drinks reception just down the corridor. So feel free to come after the Q&A, come and have a more informal conversation with us there. So thank you for joining us. Mike, over to you.
Well, thanks, Gudvinder. And yes, it's very nice to be back in Oxford with you. So climate change and nature recovery, from global thinking to local action. I'm going to introduce that theme in a minute, but first of all, I'm going to do my thanks at the beginning because talks often end on that point. But I'm going to talk about a lot of work that's been done in collaboration with many people, far too many to list. So I'm going to name check, generally speaking, my Natural England colleagues, particularly in the climate change team, but also IPCC colleagues. And I've just seen Nikki appear, and also various other former colleagues, collaborators, and PhD students. And you can see where the money came from there if you're interested. But climate change and nature recovery then. And I think before we begin really to get into the meat of the subject, it's worth registering that climate shapes nature at every level, whether that's from the global distributions of biomes on the left, or the field fares in my garden over the winter months, because they're winter migrants, or indeed with altitude on a mountain like in the Lake District here. But there's also a really important interaction with the way we use and manage land. So if you look on the right-hand side in the Lake District, it's not really a natural system. The higher you go, it's more natural because the valley has been exploited more in terms of production for agriculture. And that's a theme that comes out. So understanding the impacts of climate on nature does mean that we... Oh, right, yeah. That's better, isn't it? There we go. Right, so if we want to understand what we can do about the effects of climate change on nature, firstly, there's something we can do about it because we know it interacts with land use and management, but it also means we need to understand it. And why is it not advancing then? Oh, marvelous. There we go. Thank you. It works the other way around, though. Nature also shapes climate. And we've become increasingly aware of the capacity for ecosystems to take up carbon, like this, this nice area of woodland growing fast, taking up carbon from the atmosphere on the left. But we also know that a degraded ecosystem, like the one on the right, a peatland area that's been turned into agricultural grazing and has been rather overgrazed by the looks of the bare soil there, is a source of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So again, that interaction with land use and management is central to understanding the climate-nature join-up. So that's kind of my thinking for the first bit of my title. And the second bit about the global and the local. There's an old slogan within the environmental movement about think globally, act locally. And that's never been more true. And in my own life, my own professional life, I think I've been doing quite a lot of both of those over the last few years. And that's a theme that will come out. So this is me thinking globally at COP27 in Egypt with some of my IPCC colleagues. And just to give you that a bit of context there about the global thinking, if you like, we published this report just over a year ago on the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability of systems to climate change. And this is a major global effort. Something like 34,000 scientific papers in that report, which is about 3,000 pages. I think that's right. It's not a light read. Not many people have read it cover to cover. I believe one or two have. Something like 62,000 reviewer comments. So again, the global scientific community thoroughly engaged. 270 authors, 675 contributing authors, slightly more than half men, but 67 countries and 43% of those developing countries. So very much a global effort to say, what does all the evidence that's out there, which is enormous, add up to? But what about the acting local? So this is more in my Natural England role. So I've told you what I was doing last November. This is what I was doing yesterday. So this is hot off the press, but it's with my climate change team in Northumbria with local partners, including a local farmer, talking about how to manage the land for nature-based solutions, how to benefit both biodiversity and climate. So, and as you go on, you'll find out that my view is very much that we will never tackle those big global problems if we can't anchor it in local solutions. You need to have the big perspective, but that's not enough. Necessary, but not sufficient by itself. Those of you who are not aware what Natural England is, we're the government conservation body for England. We have an independent board, but we report to a government department, DEFRA, and we have a wide range of different conservation responsibilities. Species protection, protecting habitats, agri-environment schemes, things that fund farmers to look after the land better for nature and for other environmental benefits. We manage nature reserves. Something like 150 of the national nature reserves in England are managed by us. So I have colleagues who are really out there on the ground doing nature recovery locally day by day. I don't, but they do. And then there's things around access for nature. We have a new coastal path around England that's in the process of rolling out, and that's my colleagues have been doing that. But then the bits I suppose I'm more involved with day to day are around the science and the evidence that underpins all of that and the advice that we give to government and to others. And that is a key part of our work, is to advise government. Whether they listen, we can't be responsible for, but we must try to give the best advice we can based on science, but also practical expertise. And I just thought, before we get a little bit more into the science itself, it's worth saying, what are we like as a scientific body? So on the one hand, yes, we do lots of practical stuff, we advise government, and we need evidence to underpin that. So that's the primary role of science. But we're also what's called a public sector research establishment. So we do science in our own right, We carry out research and monitoring. We produce evidence reviews. We're quite good at taking the overview. As won't be a surprise to anyone in the room to know that a lot of university academics are very good at a very narrow area. Not everyone, there's some honourable exceptions, some in the room. But taking that overview is part of our core business. And we look after data sets. We do sometimes fund research and manage research, and we collaborate with people like you. So I'm going to start with the global perspective, and you'll find that I interweave the global and the England as we go along. So what did we find when we took the big global overview and looked at the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and biodiversity? And I only have about 3 slides of 260 odd pages, so I'm happy to talk more. I'm sure Nikki's happy to talk more as well over there, just to embarrass you. But these are just some headlines, that's all they are. But they're enough, I think, to say that we have a problem here. So something like half of species that we've assessed globally, we, as in the scientific community, have shifted their ranges to higher latitudes towards the poles or to higher elevations going up the mountain, tracking suitable climate as it shifts. We've also seen shifts at the level of the biomes, those big global patterns of vegetation and structural changes in ecosystems, things like trees occurring where they didn't before. And there's an increasing number of locations where that's happening. We think there have been some extinctions or near extinctions. Probably at the moment, only about 3 well-documented actual extinctions at a global scale, but look locally, and it's quite a different picture. So right there at the bottom, climate-caused local population extinctions have been detected in 47% of 976 species that have been examined. And there's been an association with the hottest yearly temperatures there. So there's what's sometimes termed fingerprints of climate change across those extinctions. I mentioned changes at the biome scale. And so if you look back at earlier IPCC reports, you can see projections of how biomes might change. And they're there in the literature. Now this shows the global pattern of biomes, and you see a whole scatter of little points, and it is a little blurry, but you get the drift. Each of those isn't a projected change, it's an actual recorded change. Don't worry too much about the details of them. There's things like forest cover increasing or decreasing. The point is, though, again, it's this signature of climate change, the fingerprints of climate change across all this change. And if we look forward into the future, given the inevitability of some ongoing climate change, and at the moment, quite a high likelihood of rather more than we really should be contemplating, we can see that that pattern of change continues, develops, and becomes more alarming in many ways. So these 2 figures here project changes in the species that are currently present in different parts of the globe in terms of their loss. So it doesn't mean they're not moving somewhere else, but it means they've been lost from that area. And you can see even at 1.5 degrees of global warming on the left there, which is the Paris Agreement objective to strive to hold climate change to that. Even at that sort of minimalist level, which we're not too far off, you can see that in some parts of the world, we're looking at perhaps 50 or more % of the species that are currently there no longer finding suitable conditions in those places. That's effectively what it shows. If we get to 3 degrees of global warming, then the picture becomes much, much worse. And really very high levels of global warming, the 75% level is that red color there of species lost, which is somewhere we don't want to go, frankly. So global, let's bring it back, if not exactly local, at least to the England scale. And my colleague Simon Duffield published this paper in Biological Conservation back in 2021. And what we did was to look at our own nature reserves with the people who manage those sites. So we came in with national level expertise in climate change, but the local expertise in their site, and to assess of the features, which is species or habitats essentially, for which those sites were designated, the biodiversity aspects of those sites, were they at high, medium or low risk? And you can see that across a range of different habitat types, ranging from coastal on the left through to uplands on the right, you can see that in all cases of those different sort of landscapes, you can see that most of those features, most of those habitats or species were at medium or high risk or risk from climate change. So that, you know, it's the traffic light system. The amber and the red is a warning. And there are patterns there as well, ones which make quite a lot of sense. I mean, it is an expert assessment, so I know the process that went through, but you can see the upland species and habitats are at risk from warming, the coastal ones from rising sea level, and freshwater ones from changes in patterns of rainfall, both floods, but also particularly droughts. So I'm going to move on from the impacts, and 20 years ago, I'd have probably just stayed telling you more about the impacts. But for me, the big question is, well, what do we do about it? And broadly speaking, in climate change terms, we think about mitigation and adaptation, two broad categories. Mitigation, I like to think of as tackling the causes of climate change, reducing emissions, but also sequestering carbon. There are other elements, but that will do for now. And adaptation is dealing with the consequences. How do we reduce vulnerability where we can? And how do we adjust to changes that we can't prevent? We're not going to send back the species that have moved north. We have to manage for them where they are. And if we look at the global scale again from our IPCC report, we went through, and I have to tell you, there's a very large literature now on what we might do to reduce the vulnerability of biodiversity to climate change. And we went through and categorized what was there in the literature. And then we looked to see, well, how much evidence is there to support each of these different proposed ways of adapting to climate change to maintain biodiversity? I won't go through in detail, but you can see that protecting large areas of natural and semi-natural habitat is right up there at the top. That's a kind of starting point that builds an intrinsic resilience. And then we can go through some of the things where we have to adapt. So we have to change strategies and site objectives, which sounds a little bit prosaic, but if you don't do it, things like the money don't follow. So you need to get that right. And you can go on through a number of different other areas there. One of the most commonly cited ones comes three up from the bottom over here, increasing connectivity to allow species to move. That's, I would contend, not the one for which there's the most evidence, but there's nevertheless good reason to suppose that at least for some species, that's going to be a necessary thing to help. And then we can go on to those where there's less evidence out there in the literature. Doesn't mean they're not right, it's just the evidence base isn't there. And this is a guide to where research could perhaps be done in future. And I write down at the bottom, ex situ conservation, so taking species out of their habitats and putting them in a seed bank or something. That's a little hard to see whether that will work or not at the moment. It's a sort of last resort, really. Not to say we shouldn't do it, though. I'm going to take you through a few examples in our English context to illustrate those. But one sort of general issue is to what extent we're managing inevitable change and to what extent we're trying to protect what's there. And there's a number of different ways of articulating it, and the language is used in different ways by different people. So some people will talk about building resilience. And some people will talk about enabling persistence. That's my word, actually. And then resisting change is another one. And there's a whole ecological literature about resistance and resilience that I do know about, but I'm not going to talk about. Happy to chat later if you want. But the broad issue is that the more the climate changes, the more we have to face up to inevitable change and manage for the best outcome. And that may mean quite dramatic transformations. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. It's not where we want to be, but we'd be failing to do our job, or I'd be failing to do my job if I didn't look at that possibility. So what does all this mean? So at the building resilience and reducing vulnerability end of things, people often cite a review that was done in the British context by a group of experts led by John Lawton, Professor Sir John Lawton, calling the Making Space for Nature review. And they coined this wonderful term, bigger, better, more joined. We want habitats that are bigger patches, more of those patches. We want them managed better for better outcomes, and we want them joined up so species can move around. And that's sort of a starting point. And when you think about our very fragmented landscape, with patches of semi-natural habitat in an agricultural matrix, that makes a lot of sense. But we also need to work at a larger scale of restoring ecosystem processes, getting hydrology right. You'll never get peatlands to be restored if you don't get that catchment scale sorted. We need to reduce some direct effects of climate change. And we may need to also reduce other pressures. If a stream is having water abstracted from it for water supplies, then when a drought comes, as will come more frequently and more severely with climate change, then there's less water there to buffer it against that. So the impacts will be bigger. We can sometimes intervene directly. And this is an example from the Norfolk Broads, Cowthorpe Broad, which is at risk of salination of seawater coming in. And it's very close to the coast. It's a freshwater system, but it's very close to the sea. And to keep the water high in the Broad, which is the best way of preventing it, if you keep the water level high, then there's no opportunity for the salt water to come in and displace it. We have here a little wind pump that pumps the water to keep the water level high. It's a sort of really interventionist way of protecting things. It's not really where we want to go, but in some circumstances, that will work quite nicely. There's also increasing evidence. There are parts of the country which are just a bit cooler. And some of this is common sense. North-facing slopes are cooler. Mountaintops are cooler. And it tends to be a little bit more buffered by the sea as well, the temperature. So you can find cool spots within a landscape or at a national level. And these maps here show the potential for maintaining species in a local area, even if nationally they're vulnerable to climate change. So for the conservationists, there's a clue that perhaps if we can target some of our efforts here, we have a better chance of holding on to some species. At the managing and change end of things, there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do. Rising sea levels on the coast is a very big issue. Day before yesterday, I was up in Northumbria, actually on the coast at Lindisfarne, which is a very famous coastal site with an island that's accessible by a causeway at low tide. Now, at some coastal sites, it's been possible to do what's called managed realignment. So allow for the fact that the sea level is rising and to reinstate natural processes that have often been stopped by hard sea defences, to allow the land to roll back and create those natural habitats, good for species, but also good for people. And there's a small example from Brownsea Island on the right there. We can also change things like when we do conservation operations. When do we cut hedgerows? We try and avoid cutting hedgerows when the birds are nesting. The birds are nesting earlier. We may need to cut the hedgerows at a different time. We can also adapt our objectives for a site. And we're doing a big review at the moment of our sites of special scientific interest. And we're looking to see whether the objectives need to be updated, if you like, to take account of where species are now rather than where they were in the future. We can look at colonizations by species which are good for conservation, things like the silver-spotted skipper below, which was just had a toehold in southern England, and it's spreading northwards as the temperature warms. That's not exactly that's not why I'm calling a near native, really. Those would be the ones that would be just the other side of the channel. But you know, if it's a butterfly, that's probably a good thing to conserve. It may be at risk lower down its range. And then allowing species to move, we can make the landscape more permeable by patches within it and things like hedgerows. And finally, and the one that's perhaps most controversial here, is physically moving species that can't move themselves. And this rather looks like a bunch of nature conservationists on a Scottish mountain looking for the lost contact lens. It isn't. It's actually looking for the very distinctive lichen just there, which okay, it looks really similar. No, it looks the same as all the other ones around it. But believe it or not, it is a different lichen. And this was a trial translocation just outside of its natural range, or at least its observed range. And that was a relatively sort of dip your toe in the water type approach, just going, you know, I can't remember exactly how far it was, but a few tens of kilometers in the Scottish Highlands by my colleagues from Nature Scot, to test how it will work on something that's not going to cause a lot of harm in a new location. So translocations, they're not widely done, not for climate change, but it is starting to happen. Now, my colleague Simon, when he did this paper with a couple of others of us, went on to ask our nature reserve managers, you know, given all the risks we've identified with you from climate change, how are you responding? How are you adapting? And he characterized their responses in a number of different ways. And I've just given you a sort of broad headline. So the red symbols show people who responded by saying, well, we need more evidence. We'll build the evidence. There's quite a lot of them. Another one was we'll change ways of working. So that might be cutting hedgerows or scrub at a different time. So, you know, you give the birds a chance to breed, or because the land's waterlogged in winter. And then the purple one is where it's managing change. So this is the, you know, facing the facts that things are not how they were and changing your objectives. And then the blue one is different shades of resilience, different sort of things that we might do anyway, bigger sites, better condition, and so on. And the story there is quite simple, that almost all of what we're doing is actually in that space of building resilience, which is probably stuff we'd do anyway. It's good to do, but we haven't yet really fully engaged with the inevitability of change, the altered facts on the ground. Okay, well, I'm coming to the end of my little section on adaptation for conservation. And just to flag up, one of the other parts of our job is to make this sort of evidence available. Believe it or not, not everyone wants to read 3,000 pages of an IPCC report, or even 300 pages of it. So we do have a more accessible summary tailored for England in our climate change adaptation manual, and also some webinars. And getting that message out and communicating in a way that's accessible is a really important part of the job. Now, I'm going to change gears slightly to the concept of nature-based solutions, which has been taking a lot of my time the last few years. And I know there's a nature-based solutions initiative in Oxford, so I'm not going to go into great lengths about the fundamental concept, but I'll just note for now there's been It's been fairly well established as a concept by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, but it's only in the last year or so that it's really acquired a degree of international legitimacy since the UN at their Environment Assembly recognized a much longer definition. I'm not going to give you those definitions. I've wasted too much of my life talking about definitions of nature-based solutions. But the nub of it, the essence of it, is addressing societal challenges, of which they don't come much bigger than climate change. Addressing societal challenges in ways that benefit both people and nature, or biodiversity. So it's that win-win for people and nature. And we'll go and think about that a bit more. So we step back to the global again. What do we find in our IPCC report? We found that the adaptation side of nature-based solutions, which is sometimes called ecosystem-based adaptation, it's actually an older term, can deliver adaptation for people. So not reducing risks for nature alone, but reducing risks from people. Because there sure as anything are a lot of risks, aren't there? Particularly often for people who are most vulnerable anyway, people who are poor, people who are living in conditions close to sources of hazards like rising sea levels. And there are ways that we can reduce their risks that also help biodiversity. So some of the examples of what we've termed feasible and effective ecosystem-based adaptation include natural flood management, both at the coast and in rivers, urban cooling, reducing wildfire risk. And there are a number of caveats to nature-based solutions. We'll talk those through a bit as we go. One is it needs to be done well, and the other is that they, of course, themselves are vulnerable to climate change, so may need to be adapted. But let's put some pictures in. So natural flood management. This was on the top left. This is a small river, Swindale Beck in the Lake District, which has been restored to its original channel. It had been straightened, turned into a nice straight line, take the water off the fields quickly, but that's the rub. It takes the water off quickly, and if you're downstream, that increases the risk of flooding. So putting back the natural meanders in the system, what's sometimes called rewiggling of the river, slows the flow of the river, and it absorbs, it allows water to infiltrate into the soil better, but it also just slows it up, and that makes all the difference. And similarly at the coast, I mentioned managed realignment, good for biodiversity, also actually pretty good for providing a buffer of natural habitats to prevent people being flooded. And that's an example at Medmurray on the south coast, where you can see the old field lines still in there, but the sea being allowed to come back in. And it's something we've got rather good at in the UK in the recent years. And then urban cooling, and I have had it said, well, we knew that, didn't we? And you think of a sort of a Mediterranean square on a hot day, and it's typically got trees, isn't it? It's a nice shady space, and providing shade from trees, but also green space when it's at least properly hydrated. The evaporation of water, or the evaporation and transpiration, the evapotranspiration has a cooling effect as well. So cities with green space in are a little bit cooler than those that aren't, all of which makes it more livable for people. So that's the adaptation side, and the evidence base is growing quite well on that. But I'm going to move over to the climate change mitigation side, the carbon story, I guess, for most of the rest of the talk. And I want to start, before we get into the details of nature-based solutions for carbon and for climate, I want to go back to some basic first principles. In many ways, climate change is an ecological problem. Fossil fuels are obviously deposits that were once vegetation, and the emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide, is a release of that ecologically fixed carbon into the atmosphere. Something like 35 gigatons, most recent estimate of how much is going into the atmosphere globally from fossil fuel. But it's not the only source. Land use change is also contributing another 5 gigatons. And the biggest element of that is deforestation, more tropical than temperate. But that's not the whole story. The biosphere, the terrestrial biosphere, is taking up about 1/3 of those fossil fuel emissions, and the ocean is also taking up a similar amount. So to me, that's the evidence that actually nature-based solutions have to be part of the bigger solution. You have to try and stop that term of land use change, and we have to maximize the uptake. And there's a lot of interest, isn't there? I don't think anyone could have missed, if you've been in UK environment scene for any time at all, you know that afforestation is one of the big ways we're trying to tackle it. But it's also really important to restore peatlands, and potentially also the bottom line there, to look at salt marsh and grassland restoration. And we did our own review of the scientific literature at an England scale, although drawing on data from across the whole of the UK and also Northwest Europe. So my colleague Ruth Gregg led this review of carbon storage and sequestration by habitats, because one of the things that's quite surprising is that actually this has hardly ever been done. People tend to work on one habitat. So you get woodland specialists, you get salt marsh specialists. Doing the comparison is quite a big job in its own right. And I'm not going to go through the detail of that, but this is a sort of summary of how different habitats store carbon. And if you just look at it at that big broad brush level, you can see a few things really stand out as holding a lot more carbon per hectare than others. And those are the peatlands, massive amounts in peatlands. The next highest is woodland. I would, however, say, if you look at those bars, they're not error bars as such, they're the range of values reported in the literature, and they're enormous. So site-to-site variation really matters, back to that idea of the local mattering. And we also looked at the flux of carbon, the uptake or the release of it. And again, there's a couple of big stories. One is there's a massive amount of release of carbon from peatlands in bad condition, things like blanket bog and raised bog. But there's some sequestration, decent amounts of sequestration by woodland. Just to draw a few more general conclusions, and if we look at different habitat types, when you create a new woodland or another habitat type, there's a typical pattern where at first the carbon builds up quite quickly and then it flattens out. It flattens out at a higher level for woodlands than most others, but one carries on sequestering as long as conditions are suitable, and that's peatland. Very slowly, but steadily. And those are totally schematic graphs, and one of my big efforts at the moment is to try and quantify some of those a bit better. This is a gratuitous figure from that report, which was distilled from White and Woods and from a number of pieces of work that your Vinda will know very well. You won't, not in this form, but if you look at the different elements of it, you can see that even quite an old wood, an old unmanaged stand of woodland still takes up carbon. So the net ecosystem exchange, the purple line on the right, shows there's still a decent take up of carbon dioxide. But actually, both the uptake and the loss, the ecosystem respiration, are quite large terms. So it's a small part of the actual balance of those two is small relative to the individual fluxes, even though it's quite a decent amount, 6 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare compared to other habitats. So it is actually a little bit vulnerable. So it needs to be looked after. Of course, the university does a brilliant job of looking after Wyton Woods. I think we can say that. If we look at a new woodland, there's a typical pattern, and this is modelled data from the Woodland Carbon Code, which is a very useful resource, really, for looking at carbon in the UK. And you can see that the sequestration rate, the rate of uptake, peaks very early on. There's a big pulse of it. But the storage of the carbon, the amount of carbon that's actually there in the timber and also in the soil, builds up over time. So even though an old wood may not be sequestering carbon as fast as a new one, it's still very valuable. It becomes increasingly important as a store of carbon rather than a sink for it. So we came up with a few general principles for nature-based solutions to climate change from that report. And I'll rattle through them quickly. Some of them I've already sort of hinted at, but we need to protect and restore peatlands. We need to create new native broadleaf woodlands. If we want to meet the biodiversity objective of nature-based solutions, it's important that we don't just rely on non-native conifer species, as Britain has often done over the last 100 years. We should restore and protect natural coastal processes that support some of these coastal habitats like salt marsh. But we should protect all of our semi-natural habitats, including our grasslands, which, although it's not as much, generally speaking, we think, as in woodlands, it still does have carbon in it and supports distinctive biodiversity. We need to target nature-based solutions where they can have most value. And we need to integrate them into landscapes that are used for other things like growing food. And finally, we need to fill some of those evidence gaps with research and monitoring, and to ensure that adaptation and mitigation are planned together. There's no point creating a habitat that's not going to survive if we get a few more fractions of a degree of warming. Now, nature-based solutions can go wrong, and I've also spent quite a lot of time on this from the global perspective. So it's really important to get the evidence right, but also to take account of local knowledge and to work inclusively with people. And, you know, spoiler alert, when that isn't done, it can go horribly wrong. And there's unfortunately a track record of people doing things like planting trees in the wrong place. There's a paper there, which does mention two examples of places where trees don't naturally grow. One is temperate raised bogs. One is the savannas, which are naturally, well, they have trees, but they're sparse trees. They're not gappy woods that need to be filled up. And that's not a nature-based solution to grow the wrong species in the wrong place. And actually, in the case of the peatlands and sometimes the savannas, it can do more harm than good for carbon as well. So we need to see climate change adaptation, even by nature-based solutions, in a broader context. And one of the concepts which we tried to develop in this IPCC report is that of climate resilient development. So climate resilient development is quite an inclusive term. It's not widely used, but we've been trying to get it out there as a concept. So it brings together both adaptation and mitigation. We need to adapt. We also need to reduce the causes of climate change. But to do it well, it needs to be considered across government and civil society. It needs to involve everyone. Partnerships are really important to that. It doesn't require you know, the experts from the developed world, so-called, to appear in the global south with the solutions. They don't work without that local knowledge, and it's just wrong. So drawing on wide-ranging knowledge matters. Conserving and restoring ecosystems is an important part of it, but also some of the social factors like involving marginalized groups, equity and justice issues, and reconciling different interests and worldviews, and inevitably more money. And I'm not going to go into that, but there's no getting away from that, unfortunately, and more international cooperation. And we can see if we don't get all those things lined up, different pathways to the future become opened or closed. And we've probably already closed off some. So we need to work in a joined up way across the whole of the Sustainable Development Goals, if I can drop that into the conversation. But sticking with the ecology for now, it was one of my achievements, I feel, to get through in our summary for policymakers, the sort of pithy bit at the front. Nothing with the IPCC is pithy, but anyway, the shorter bit, this statement here, that safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystems is fundamental to climate resilient development. We can't look after people without looking after our ecological context. So I'm coming towards the end, but in the last, I don't know, 5 minutes or so, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about a project that's occupying a lot of my time at the moment. So this isn't a review of what we've done and what the scientific world's done, but this is live, this is happening. So we have a big project on nature-based solutions for climate change at the landscape scale to try and learn better how to do nature-based solutions. We were fortunate to get £12.5 million from the UK Treasury, which might be my biggest achievement of my career, I don't know. But it's also working very closely with the government departments of DEFRA and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, which we're not allowed to call DESNES, so I clearly didn't. We lead it in Natural England, but working with Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, who are looking at some of the more mechanistic side of understanding where the carbon goes in an ecosystem, and also developing some techniques around remote sensing, but also the Environment Agency and the Forestry Commission. And really critically, we have 6 pilot areas around the UK, which are led by, are led locally. Remember where I started, think globally, act locally. So that this is where I was yesterday, up there in Northumbria. But we've got a scatter of them across England. So we want to learn lessons from that, scientific lessons, but also practical lessons. And we have 4 work streams. One's about managing the programme. One, or 2 rather, which I lead, is around biodiversity and carbon. Then Q look a bit more at, say, the processes on carbon, and then also blended funding and governance. And I did slip in a reference to money, and it's certainly a big priority of this government to get other people to pay for this sort of stuff. They recognise it's important, but if they can get the private sector to pay some of it, then they're very happy. So we're looking at the practicalities of that, and what you need to do to make that work. Governance, the official term, and if you work in this field at all, people talk about the Wild West. It's always the Wild West. I don't know. But anyway, the Wild West of carbon finance, because it's not very well governed and regulated at the moment anyway. And we're looking to do our piece to help that process. So our pilot sites then, these are landscape scale areas, more than 500 hectares, but they're not rewilding of 500 hectares. That's great in the right place, but for a lot of England, it's not going to happen. It's about looking at where you can restore habitats or create them in areas of mixed land use, like here in Gloucestershire, one of our pilot sites there. So we're working with established partnerships. We didn't have enough time to start them off from scratch and still do the research. So we wanted people who are already in the game, but they need to provide access for research and be willing to explore some of those issues around governance and funding. And also deliver a wider set of benefits. But the point at the bottom is what really matters, I think, is evaluation is key. If you deal with government policy, evaluation is a really important term. Does it work? Put it bluntly. And there's a whole set of guidelines around it. So-called Magenta book from the Treasury is all about, does it work? So that's what we're trying to find out. Is what they're doing delivering? And we ask people to apply to get funding to do this work. And we set some priority types of habitat creation that we were interested in, and then we turned it over to them. They had a bit more flexibility than sometimes with a government grant. And we were interested not just in things that we were confident would be good for taking up carbon and biodiversity, like broadleaf woodland, but also some things that are sometimes claimed to be where we didn't feel the evidence base was that good, for example, around species-rich grasslands. And it's quite interesting to see what they came back with. Species-rich grassland creation was a popular one, but so was wood pasture, trees planted into a grassland system, which, you know, when you think about it, makes some sense. You can potentially get more carbon, but you can still go on grazing the land. And anyway, you can go through, we see we've got a range of different habitats there, some of which are a bigger priority for us to study than others. But then our work stream is going through and looking at those habitats to measure carbon and biodiversity. I'll just flick through quickly a few things. So we're sampling soil. Here's my colleague Jess, looking quite scary with a mallet. She just went on maternity leave, so hopefully she's not doing too much of that now. And then we're sampling soil. And one of the things that surprised me when we did our review, there's a lot of data for habitats at 0 to 15 centimetres. Not much at 15 to 30 centimetres. No, not even that, is it? So we're going to 30 centimetres. And for some habitats, greater depths also matter, but they tend to be a bit more stable. Anyway, we're analysing those in the field and in the lab. And this is some early results showing, and please don't quote this anywhere, it's very preliminary data, but it does show that if you look at as the age of the site increases, so this is looking at habitats of different age, you can see the amount of carbon builds up, and there's more of it at the shallow depth than at the deeper depth. But it's not a trivial amount lower down. But we'll unpack that in a lot more detail when we've got more data. We're also measuring tree biomass, and we're measuring gas fluxes. And we're measuring the structure of the vegetation and recording what species are there. We're also working with our colleagues from Kew to develop ways of using ground-based LiDAR, laser scanning, to assess how much biomass and therefore how much carbon is in hedgerows and scrub, a rather neglected area. A lot of interest in what the potential is there. So I've come to the end of my whistle-stop tour of climate and nature recovery, globally and locally. And just a few conclusions to leave you with. First of all, what you probably already knew when you came here was that climate change is indeed a threat to ecosystems and biodiversity. The evidence on that has just grown massively. Adaptation, restoration, and protection of ecosystems reduces the risks not just to nature, but also to people. Nature-based solutions tackle the biodiversity and climate crises in a joined-up way and can provide multiple benefits. But you need both world-class science and practical local knowledge to implement them well. Sorry, I'm getting slightly out of sync. And my bottom line is this one. If we are going to tackle the nature and climate crises, then there's no time to get our methods of doing that sorted out perfectly before we deploy them. We have to go to a different sort of doing research, which I call learning by doing. And if you look at medicine or engineering, they've been doing it for years. So that's my takeaway message for you. Think globally, act locally, and learn by doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We'll now open up to questions. Any questions from the audience? If you've got any online questions, just stick them in the chat as well.
Hello. I'm the chair of directors at Bioabundance Community Interest Company, and we have put forward a proposal for 100 square miles based at Otmore to be turned into a regional nature park. Now, at the moment, when Boris Johnson came up with his 10-point plan, he talked about creating 10 new nature areas. But I don't know what sort of designation they had, because 100 square miles doesn't fit into being any of the current designations. So is there space for a new designation of that kind of size? And would that help at all?
That's interesting. I mean, that sort of size, it tends to be more in terms of national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, rather than site scale, site of special scientific interest. I think it probably depends what you mean by a designation. I mean, often it's approached as projects. So the landscape recovery pilots for the landscape recovery scheme, you're probably aware of that, which is a big initiative at the moment from government to fund that. It's not about providing protection, it's about providing the resource to do it. Part of me as the statutory conservationist says, yes, of course, we're going to need to protect it. But the other thing is I'm quite mindful some people will not do things if they're protected, because often the way we manage those protections at the moment really constrains your options. So I think if you did introduce some sort of designation, particularly at that scale in a crowded country like ours, it would have to have more flexibility probably than we currently have with the SSIs. So I think it's an interesting idea, and I mean it's also worth saying with the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, did come up with a commitment that everyone signed up to, including the UK, to protect 30% of our land by 2030. So there has to be some sort of designation, in inverted commas, under that. A lot of the emphasis on that is getting more from national parks, but I think it's a really interesting idea, and it would be interesting to see. I've rambled around the issues, so I don't know really, but I think it's an interesting idea, and we certainly need something in that space. If you want here.
So I really enjoyed your talk. The only thing I missed was the topic of disturbances, both for adaptation, but then also in terms of permanence of carbon sequestration.
Yeah. Do you mean sort of natural disturbance, or do you mean
biotic,
but
also fire?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Some habitats, some ecosystems are naturally disturbed, and I mean, fire is a good example, isn't it? So, boreal forests and savannas are fire-adapted ecosystems where the British uplands, were once blanket bogs and still are degraded blanket bogs and weren't really a fire ecosystem. So, in the one case, it's a positive benefit. In the other case, it's a threat. So I think context is everything with disturbance, and again with livestock and grazing, and I mean there are certainly species that wouldn't exist without a disturbed system. It's one of the reasons why cattle are often preferred for grazing, is that they cause more disturbance of the surface. I think it's one of those things where actually there isn't a global answer. I think it comes back to that issue about being locally appropriate and taking into account how climate change may change that disturbance regime, and whether you want to hold that back, which could be quite hard, but with something like wildfire in a non-fire adapted system, there's things you can do. You can reduce public access at times of higher fire risk. You can educate people not to have a barbecue when there's a big fire risk. But I mean, I'm laughing. I don't know why I am really, because I've just this week I did see examples where that exactly that had happened. So yeah, it's another part of that quite complicated mosaic, but comes down to, I think, knowing your system locally.
I was just interested in the case studies towards the end of the talk. There was number 4 near Oxford, and I didn't know anything about that. So I was wondering if you could tell us what that case study is.
Yes, so this is the Freshwater Habitats Trust, who have pulled together a series of sites within a fairly loose definition of a landscape. And yes, that's the one that's probably moving slowest, but they're developing plans, and a lot of that's focused on floodplain mosaics and looking to recreate more biodiverse wetland systems in floodplains. They did a lot of good work near Farmore and Pink Hill Meadows, which we had a look at the other day, but they're looking at other areas stretching out like Coleswood Hill Way, sort of on the border with Wiltshire. And then there are other sites as well. So it's a sort of, it's slightly different to the others, and it's more of a determined, if you like, by the river system than by a landscape scale area.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. You mentioned acquiring funding, trying to go through the private sector. From your experience, what has that tended to involve? Is it kind of taking the natural capital approach and trying to find like the beneficiaries and yeah, acquiring funding that way, or is there another avenue that it tends to be going about at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think to date, probably the best example has been through the Woodland Carbon Code, and for woodlands, and it's a voluntary carbon market. So that, that's something that's live and happening. The other thing, it's not particularly climate driven, but biodiversity net gain to offset the effects of development not by allowing you to destroy the most unique habitats, but ones which are a bit more common but still have some value, looking to restore more than you've lost. That's something that's kind of on the verge, I think. The wider natural capital, I think it's where there's a lot of interest in that and discussion around stacking and bundling of benefits. So you take that broader perspective and not just carbon. I have to say, I'm not really seeing that deployed at large scale with the full market potential developed. It may come, we'll see. I suppose the other thing that does spring to mind is what the water companies have done for water. And some of that's been around water companies buying land to manage, because the water quality issues are best tackled that way, and I've seen examples of that. And sometimes, that may be more by supporting other projects to do that. I think that we're still really at quite early days, I'd say, but certainly a massive interest around it.
Actually working. I don't think.
For the online audience.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, this is perhaps follows on from that. I mean, you've given some lovely examples of what are essentially pilot schemes, but we do need to do whole landscapes. And from my area of expertise, which is water and flooding, it's no good just wiggling one little stream. You've got to do a whole catchment if you actually want to have a nature-based solution which stops floods around Oxford, for example. Is there any appetite within government to really look at entire landscapes and, if you like, the entire countryside and manage it in a more, if you like, climate resilient way?
I think there's an appetite for it. Whether we're really seriously moving towards that scale, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the landscape recovery program does offer that potential, but it's still early days, and they're piloting that, but they're not even doing anything on the ground yet. They're working up proposals for it. I mean, it is in the water space that we've probably come closest. I mean, Swindale it is a whole catchment, but it's a small one, and certainly by the time you get to the scale of Oxford, as I don't know why I'm telling you this, Richard, you probably know this much better than I do, but the catchment is enormous, isn't it? And to really make a difference to a city like Oxford with all the Thames catchment upstream is a massive task. And it does seem to me it's worked better at those, at the smaller scale, with a small catchment and a particularly vulnerable settlement at the end of it. But you're the expert.
Just while I'm sure you know this, Richard, the Even Load Valley is one of the pilot landscape recovery projects led by farmers.
We need to start moving up to,
yes,
and even beyond. It's a whole philosophy, I suppose, of managing the countryside.
Yes,
in
at that scale.
Resilient way, and how we get there, I don't know. But we've had talks about natural capital, private sector investment, money from the water companies maybe, but it all needs to put into a big structure.
Yes, I think that's a challenge. but I think there's interest around that even load catchment as a possible demonstration. I just think there's a couple of questions from online, and I'll go back to the audience for a few more. One from Senan Powell, which I'll briefly paraphrase. It's around if National England is giving advice to the government both on adaptation and on mitigation, is there a risk that the adaptation is more attractive than the mitigation activities, and it'll disincentivize the mitigation plans? The old chestnut around whether adaptation analyze climate change.
I think we have to get away from that either or, because once you look at adaptation and you look seriously at it, you can see it becomes increasingly difficult as you get to higher levels of global warming, and of course more expensive as well. So I think if you actually seriously engage with adaptation, it naturally leads you to the conclusion that you have got, it's not an alternative. You have to mitigate as aggressively as you can if you've got a chance of adaptation actually being able to hold on to the things you value. So I know people originally said that, but the fact is, we already have over a degree of global warming, and we're already seeing impacts. So we can't ignore it. But yeah, it's a fair point. The messaging needs to be clear that it's not an alternative, and every fraction of a degree of global warming matters, and that's absolutely stands. Adaptation doesn't change any of that, and I do make that point. I mean, and people like the Climate Change Committee are a sort of statutory advisor on climate change, and they hold the government to account on that. But at the end of the day, we're a democracy, and the government make their choices, as we know.
Great. And one more from online from Claire Boardman. Is there any scope for citizen science or participatory science programs in the projects that you mentioned?
Yes, and some of them do locally have an element of that. It's not something we're focusing on at the moment because we've got a short time and lots to do, but I think there's definitely potential. Yeah, and yeah, I think we'd welcome that. And it's we're not secret. We're well, we'd like to talk to people if they're interested in working with us. Yeah.
Great. And back to the audience. And any more?
Following on from Richard's point about landscape scale approaches, we're doing something up around the Even Load actually, where we've got the Glyme Valley, and we're mobilizing 20 different villages, communities to get together and get the information and activities going in parallel to what's going on with Cotswold National Landscape and the Even Load catchment people. So that's, for me, a really important part of it. Following on from that, I'm curious with yourselves at the point you are in this, when you talk about local knowledge, how far does that go? Does that go to the extent that you're seeking solutions, historical solutions from communities who have been there for around our area 500, 1,000 years. And how much does that factor in?
So yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the locally led initiative is a really good thing. I mean, I live in Hungerford, small rural town in West Berkshire, and there's a locally led initiative about creating a wetland reserve there. And, you know, it's had nothing to do with me, and I'm, you know, happy to support it. And there's some really impressive examples. And that has a similar, you know, sort of 500 years of tradition since the townspeople were given the manorial rights to grazing and fishing and managing and owning the land. So, you know, there are some good traditional management knowledge, and, you know, Natural England will always seek to work with those people. I'm only hesitating because I think we've also heard people claim things as traditional management that they want to do and are damaging. So sometimes we're in conflict. There's no doubt about that.
I think there's a bit of a lack of trust issue in both directions there. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sometimes. But I mean, you hear about the controversies. You know, I mean, recently it's been Dartmoor. There's no secret about that. But there's an awful lot of good partnership working. You know, where I've been this week, I've seen great partnership working between ourselves, our local area teams, and people on the ground there. You know, and a lot of it does come down to those individual relationships. And I think one of the things we've learned as well is that, you know, actually having people who know their patch and really develop those human interactions, you know, the just knowing people as well as the place really does get the better results than, you know, if you're the disembodied official from far away. And, you know, at our best, that's what I think we do.
We'd like you to invite you to come and see them.
Lovely. Yeah, great.
Thank you. So you had shown a plot where you know how I think the sequestering plateaus after a certain period of time, right? So was that on an individual tree level, or was it on a habitat level? That was.
Oh, so there was a habitat level. Yeah. I mean, an individual tree will also typically come to a plateau, but then of course it will die, and, you know, then it'll decline.
But I mean, with that reference, you know, like, are we neglecting the ecological services that the habitat will provide and the expansion and supporting the expansion of the tree coverage later on? Are you accounting that into it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing with an old tree, even if it gets to the point where it's not sequestering carbon, typically it will have a much greater biodiversity than a young tree, and it will be an important store of carbon. And, you know, leaving it there, you know, in my book is the best thing you can do. I mean, if you're managing a plantation or timber, then it's not going to get to that point. But it's actually one of the things that there's a lot of nature that isn't that great in England compared to the rest of Europe. But actually, we have the highest number of veteran trees, big old trees, in Europe. So that's something we really ought to protect. And, you know, mainly for the biodiversity, to be honest, but they also carbon stores, and it does stay there a long time. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers, thanks. I very much enjoyed the talk. I particularly enjoyed your peat sequestration graphs. And I guess my question is, I've been in a water limited country for a long time. And under climate change, the water's really, really important. So how vulnerable are our peatlands to climate change over the next century, and how much of a risk is there from those falling apart?
Some of them are very vulnerable. I mean, Southeast Asian peatlands, particularly in peat forests, very, you know, the incidence of fire in recent decades has been a massive issue. I think that there's often an interaction there with management, you know, and clearance, and even the fragments that left behind are vulnerable. And I mean, again, it's hard to give a global you know, summary, but
I was asking for an English summary. Oh, actually. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, right. Well, okay. Yeah. No, our peatlands are vulnerable to drying out in a warm summer. If they're in good condition, though, they will hold the water very well. And whilst they may not be sequestering more carbon, as long as they stay waterlogged most of the time, you're not going to get massive releases. So, yeah, there are areas which will get progressively harder to restore. I think that's true. But over most of the areas where most of the peatlands are, if you get the hydrological conditions right, there's a degree of resilience to even a dry summer. But where once the hydrology is wrong and they get fragmented and degraded, then they are, you know, that much more vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a very quick question. In relation to those 6 sites for the nature-based solutions, I was just wondering, are any of them in include urban areas?
Sorry,
the 6 sites.
Urban areas. Yes, they are actually. Yeah. So there's a site at Plymouth, which includes green space within the city and also some on the edge of it. And also the Derbyshire site, it sort of follows the Derwent Valley. So it starts in the Peak District, which is pretty rural, but then it comes into Derby. So there are 1 or 2. It's probably better to say peri-urban than actually truly urban. But Plymouth, yeah, very much so.
Thanks.
Thanks, Micah. Just to round off, so looking at your list of where the evidence base was for adaptation or mitigation, there's a nature-based solutions in the UK focus. If there were 1 or 2 research areas that these are the ones that would really help us move forward on something that's blocking progress, and what would you pick? What would you?
I mean, I think for me the main thing is a bit more generic in the sense that I think we need much more assessment and evaluation of projects that are being carried out to see if they're delivering the benefits that we hope they will. And you know, that this has been my dream for a while, to implement a program of habitat creation and restoration and build in that sort of science-based evaluation from before the start. And so I would encourage more of that, the try it and see. And I've sort of said to people sometimes, you know, actually, if it doesn't work, that's not a failure. But if you don't learn the lessons from it, that's a failure, you know. Yes. So I think that's really what I think I'd like to see more of. And I think that applies across the physical sciences, but also actually the social science elements of it as well, and the factors that make something work or not, like the relationships with the local community, you know, and to get more of the subtlety around that. I also think there are some neglected habitats. I mean, wood pasture, it was really interesting that everybody said wood pasture. There's some work on wood pasture from a conservation perspective, very little from a sort of a climate carbon perspective in the UK anyway. So, you know, and again, scrub, long neglected habitat type. So I think there's lots to do, but those are just a couple that spring out to me.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a round of applause to Mike for something. Thank you to those that joined online as well, and for those here, we have drinks around the corner, so do feel free to come and have a more informal conversation as well.